Well, hey, good morning again. A couple days ago I talked about this thought that I've had, this recurring thought that I had graduated from a great seminary without two key components, I'm going to call, of Christian faith. One is I didn't know who I was, and I didn't know how to hear God. And I've been thinking about that a little bit more. You know, I wanted to kind of make a comment because, again, I'm not sure it's the seminary's job to train people on how to do that. And here's the reason, at least one of the reasons. The academic setting of teacher, classroom, open Bible, lecture, that environment does not lend itself to the type of discipleship that I'm talking about. But more importantly, I don't think it lends itself to actually conveying how you figure out who you are and how you figure out how to hear God. I just don't think that environment is the way to do it. I do think that the church is probably the better setting. Now, by church, I'm not talking about worship service. I'm not talking, Sunday school classroom. Maybe a small group environment might be able to assist or facilitate that. But there's an idea that I had learned from a friend of mine who used to run a school for folk arts, things like bluegrass music and fiddle, banjo, guitar. It was a folk music school over in St. Louis, and she had this concept. I'll never forget it. She called it knee to knee. You learn knee to knee, and so you can imagine kind of how this works. That you've got two chairs facing each other, and you've got one fiddle player and then a younger, or I guess it doesn't have to be younger, but another fiddle player right across, and they're sitting knee to knee, and one is copying the other. And I love that image so much because it's very organic. It's a very organic way of learning, and all fiddle players kind of end up developing their own style, their own flourish, but they all sort of begin in the same position, knee to knee, with someone else who is more skilled or has more experience. I think that's the way discipleship is done best. I don't think it's the only way. I just think it's one of the better ways of doing it, especially when you're dealing with such fundamental ideas like, who am I? How do I hear from God? So, reflecting on that a little bit, one is you kind of got to know who you are, and you kind of got to know how to hear God to a certain extent in order to teach it to someone else. Although I do think there's some value in trying to figure that stuff out with some other people. On the identity front, when you're talking about who you are, you probably need some resources, some folks that have gone before. So I'd highly recommend the book Living Fearless by Jamie Winship. Probably the best book on identity I've ever read. He and his wife run an organization called Identity Exchange, so you can pay a fee and go through some of their coursework to learn how to do it, but then also how to facilitate it in others. And there's a lot of value to that. So that's one. but being with someone in that moment, need to help them realize who they are. Now, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here because I think that one of the primary places where we can do that, especially if you're a husband and a father, is just within your own family, is trying to help your spouse and your children figure out who they are. I know for me that would have saved me a lot of heartache had I figured it out earlier in my life. But so that's one of the things I'm attempting to do with my own girls, is just to remind them, that God has given them just a little bit about who they are, and they need to lean into that because He will nuance it over a period of time. But that can only be done in relationship, knee to knee, and that's kind of the point that I'm driving at here. Is that we spend a lot of time on mass communication. I think there's a tremendous amount of value in obviously preaching and teaching, and even this type of environment where we're talking through digital means. We're just beginning to scratch the surface on how effective that can actually become. But all that to say is there's nothing quite like sitting down across the table, say at a coffee shop, or in an office type of environment, where you're just talking to a person one-on-one, or maybe one-on-two, one-on-three, working through who are you? I mean, what is the Lord calling you? And how are we going to hear God individually, and how are we going to do it together? So, I'm not trying to give you here's 5 tips to make your discipleship better. I'm not trying to do that, but at the same time, I'm trying to give you some things to think about. Your methodology, or your mindset, or your approach, whatever you call it. This is something we need to take seriously, because I believe in my heart of hearts, this is one of the great downfalls of the modern church, is we've not helped people figure out who they are, and we've not helped them learn how to actually hear the voice of God. And I think those two things are just so vital to the church going forward. So anyway, that's my thoughts for today. I'm going to stop and get some coffee again so that I don't end up taking hostages. Just kidding. And anyway, I hope you have a great day. Grace and peace.